I'm Jim Collison and live from the Gallup campus here in Omaha, Nebraska. This is Gallup's Called to Coach, recorded on April 8th, 2019. Called to Coach is a resource for those who want to help others discover and use their strengths. We have Gallup experts and independent strengths coaches share tactics, insights, and strategies to help coaches maximize the talent of individuals, teams, and organizations around the world. If you do have questions during this live webcast, we do have a chat room that's available for you. There's a link to it right below the main video on our live page. If you click that, it'll take you to a separate YouTube page, and there's a chat room there, either on the right-hand side or below the window. It depends on your resolution on your screen. It's available for you to log in. We'd love to have you ask your questions live. If you're listening to the recorded version and have questions about anything, we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email, coaching@gallup.com. Don't forget to visit the Gallup Strengths Center, just gallupstrengthscenter.com for all your CliftonStrengths coaching resources and training needs. You can catch the video now, both streaming and downloadable audio. We call that podcasting. All the cool kids are listening to their content that way now. You can get those all available off our coaches blog. The links to do that for all 4, 5, 6 webcasts we have available, it depends if you speak Spanish or not, are available on our coaches blog. Go to coaching.gallup.com. Mike McDonald is our host today. He works as a senior workplace consultant with Gallup. It's super hard to get. That's why we're doing this here on a Monday. Mike, always great to see you, and welcome back to another Call to Coach.
Yeah, I love it. Thanks, Jim. I'm very excited about the work we're doing in this upcoming series, and particularly our keynote guest to kick us off.
Mike, let me be really prescriptive before we start. We are doing this research series as a part of the series to help coaches kind of work through all the data we have available. I think one of the most underutilized resources by our coaches is Gallup.com. We did a series with Jim just a couple weeks ago. In fact, it'll be right before this one in the feed, where we talked about kind of the capstone data points that coaches, if you're only going to remember a few things, 3 is what we covered in that. These are the 3 things as a coach you want to remember. For those today, we're going to really dig into the state of the American workplace. And this, even though it's the American workplace, I think a lot of what we talk about will go across all of those. So keep that in mind. Mike, let's take a second, dig in. Why don't you get us started as we think about the State of the American Workplace report and what it means and what we can glean from it. We've brought really the expert here, Jim Harter, in to talk about it. Mike, why don't you get us started?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love the theme and the kind of the thread of thought that we have that you've been building out, Jim Collison, with the work that you and Adam Hickman have put together, and it's great for us to be able to dive in at even more levels of nuance, even more levels of detail, and really the outcome that we're shooting for is that we want entry points, right? That we want to augment all of our coaching capacity so that we go in. Not just knowing, but being able to convince potential clients that they have pressure points, pain points, problems that we and our coaching can provide direct and systemic solutions for. And these reports are incredibly powerful in creating these data insights, right? But not just the data, but the detail around them, the description around them that really bring them to life. And ultimately, we're talking about credibility, right? So our credibility is enhanced when we have specific data that starts that conversation. Nobody's going to make the decision singularly on data, but it starts to provoke some insight where we add value. We add really specific value. And each of these reports is a great way to position that. If we do our job right, I think by the end of our quick discussion here, we really want to think about bringing that content to life and putting it to work. Second, I think there's context around all of that content, though, right? It's not a static point in time measurement, but there's a lot of context around it. So how do we wrap that context around the content in a way that's compelling for our clients? But then how does our coaching fit? Right? How does true, legitimate, world-class coaching fit that specific need with intentionality? And in that last point, right, it's our credibility. It's our credibility that we know we're talking about. We can identify and diagnose situations and problems, but then get very specific with our solutions that we have to offer. And I think that's where coaching in combination with consulting really is optimized. So we're excited really to bring this conversation and put it to work for all of us. Jim, the State of the American Workplace is a massive effort. It's unbelievable in the detail, what it represents, from engagement to strengths to well-being to performance and everything else, and the dynamics of matrixed workforce and remote workforce. And as we cull and curate some of the data points that we wanted to bring to life for our coaches today. We really have a 4-point data outline. And so coaches, if you're keeping track of this, I would encourage you, as you outline your notes, start off with these 4 points. And the two Jims, Harter and Collison, and I are going to walk these out and tell some context and give some ways that these data points can be used and what they mean to us as coaches. But here's your 4 numbers as you outline your notes. The first is 60%. The second is 12%. The third is 41%. And the fourth is 18%. And now it's up to the 3 of us to bring those numbers to life and tell you what they mean. Starting off with that first one. So before I start, though, Jim Harter, thanks a ton for jumping back in again. I know we left off one part of a series, and here you are again. So thanks for bringing your time, your talent, and your insight into the American workplace.
Thanks for having me, Mike and Jim. Great to be back.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love it. Always a good conversation when we get a chance with you. So, so Jim Harter, our first conversation, our first point of reference is 60% of employees say the ability to do what they do best in a role is very important to them. It's a powerful number, right? And if we get even more inside of that, when we ask employees how important certain attributes are when considering whether they take a job within its different organization. So think about this. We're talking about true competition, coaches. Considering whether I take a job with a different organization, employees place the greatest importance on role and organization to offer them, number one, the ability to do what they do best. So just think about that as a pressure point of competition. Some organizations are going to answer that well, some are not. So Jim, if that's done well, where's the win on organizations that do that best or effectively? What do you know about that?
Well, I think from the outset, organizations need to help individuals know, how to diagnose what they do best and how that aligns with something they're offering. So they have to be very clear, and I think extremely authentic about it, because I think we'll show in some of the upcoming data points that you'll highlight. Oftentimes that's a miss in terms of how it actually gets carried out in organizations. But people intuitively know that they need a job where they can do what they do best. And the number one reason people are changing jobs, even before they kind of know that, is that they want some career growth. So I think that a lot of employees aren't seeing that alignment in their current work, and they're looking for something that matches. I think people now intuitively know that they can get a job that matches kind of who they naturally are and what their skill set has been, and how it's been developed. I think the other thing, Mike, is that how organizations can help an individual know how they can develop those skills that match their natural strengths is really important, and a differentiator as well, to kind of be assertive about putting that forward for applicants.
Yeah. I wonder, do you think they're making an assumption on the part of that stat that potential talent will, of course, believe or assume that that's part of what they have to offer, without realizing the intentionality that they have to lead with that message, and the specificity and the detail that they have to deliver on that message upstream to get somebody to consider their offer? I
think you could easily take that, for granted, but I think in this newer workforce, people are much more savvy about seeking that out for themselves. And really, and the other thing we've kind of learned is that culture and how things actually do live out in organizations is much more transparent than it's ever been before. Yeah. Technology's made that happen, and so if people are told that they can do what they do best in an organization and it doesn't play out, that's communicated pretty quickly.
Yeah, Jim, we have some pretty good research around the messaging and the mode of the messaging, right? That what are the sources of information that job candidates are using to make their decisions? I wonder if that plays a part in this.
Yeah, word of mouth is really big. It's number. If you just kind of combine the different methods that people are looking at, a lot of it has to do with word of mouth. And social circles are highly connected now, of course. Kind of goes without saying, but people are going to look at sites. They're going to look at job sites that give reviews of employers, and so that's there as well. But they're also going to go to trusted trusted word of mouth.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Jim Collison, I want to call you into this conversation. One of the 1,000 hats that you wear here at Gallup is recruiting, right? Recruiting IT talent. When you are in a conversation, right, and you have a great strengths background, you know everything inside and out about strengths, and you use it effectively with a new candidate. How do you lead with intentionality with that detail to make sure that that offer and that picture of what could be is really explicit for that potential candidate?
Mike, I think one of the things the report says, right, is especially we got to get the right fit with these individuals as well. And of course, Gallup has a selection instrument. We kind of run at an advantage where with our candidates, we kind of know in advance they're a right fit systematically into our process because we have this selection instrument that helps us do that helps us get that there. Specifically, when we think about the tech talent, then in this, we really try to drill down in getting those individuals, and through the interviewing process, figuring out, we ask them a lot of questions. I spend a lot of time in our internships and some of our early onboarding, ask them, what are you interested in? What kinds of technologies are you currently following? What kinds of things, what are interesting? We have this idea, in at least the technology space, they're looking for interesting work, right? What is interesting to them? And so we spend a lot of time kind of asking those questions. Jim, you've got a book. Jim Harter, you've got a book coming out as a manager, right? We're going to spend some time doing that. I also think you can underestimate the power of the manager in this, asking those questions, right? And saying not only during the onboarding process, but to help understand. I think this is a mistake I've made in the past, is not being as prescriptive early in those conversations. And I really mean early in the first year of getting those asking those questions around what is interesting to you, or why are you here, or what do you want to be working on. We can't, you can't meet those needs 100% of the time, but you can be asking those questions. And I think it's really, really important we get to that point. I don't know, Mike, does that kind of get us there?
It does. Jim Harter, were you reacting to something that Jim had said?
Yeah, really good points by Jim. Kind of feed back into a lot of what we've learned in our research, and how you go about kind of searching for job candidates, and that process of understanding whether they're a good fit or not has a lot to do with whether those initial impressions will match that desire to fit. So, for instance, we found just scanning the scientific literature. Frank Schmidt, one of our senior scientists, has just updated a 100-year study on successful selection processes, and they found there were 4 criteria. At least as I summarized their information, I kind of broke it down into 4 general criteria that organizations can use. And one is to review previous experiences and achievements. That's one signal about whether they're a good fit, right? Innate traits, which Jim was referring to. We've got scientific methods now that allow us to select people with innate traits that match the job type. That boosts your odds even further. You can conduct multiple interviews. Now, everybody's talked about how an individual interview can be biased, right? When you combine multiple interviews together, you can substantially reduce bias, and you get some information on whether they fit the team too, whether they fit the job and the team. And then the fourth, it's really important to help people as you're kind of coaching organizations in how to do this effectively, is probably the most difficult to get, but because it has to do with job tryouts, we call it game film. So in sports, we can watch film and know whether someone's going to fit or not, and it can be pretty accurate. In the rest of the work world, it's more difficult because it takes some internships. But to be more intentional about those internships, and even at a young age, to help people get kind of a flavor for the job. Even if you're thinking about someone moving to a managerial role, you've got ample opportunity to watch their game film on how they work with the team. To give you some insights there. So those 4 criteria can really improve whether that desire for a chance to do what I do best actually matches reality in your organization.
Yeah. The way what I'm reacting to with what both of you said is, can you convince me as a potential candidate that this is truly a cultural part of your establishment that has staying power? Or are you just telling me this one-on-one in the moment as bait to get me to say yes, and then and then I'll be surprised pleasantly or unpleasantly on the other side. So both those statements stand really strong. So as we move that forward, then we've got a nice additive story from each of these data points. So here's one, Jim, that I could not believe it. To me, it was one of the most stark realities, I think, that came out of our out of the report that you put together. But coaches, 12%. I'm going to pause there for emphasis. 12% of employees strongly agree that their organization does a great job of onboarding new employees. So think about the momentum factor, right? Think about, I'm excited. I come into this organization, and then at some point when asked about whether my organization does a great job of onboarding, only 12% are going to say yes to that. Jim Harter, what's the expanded context and pressure point there as we think about what's represented behind that data point?
Well, and they're almost identical whether you ask leaders or employees in organizations, whether their organization does a great job of onboarding. So there's almost a universal perception in most organizations that they just aren't getting that stage right, even though we know that in the first 6 months is your best chance for high engagement because people are getting more attention, right? But somehow that experience, even though they might be getting some attention, isn't carrying over to a reflective self that says that was an optimum experience for me. So it's not setting them up right. We can talk about this if you want, Mike. But we found it may not be as difficult as we might think. There are 5 kind of criteria we found that are part of really successful onboarding programs. One is, does the person come out of that onboarding process? And by the way, I'd argue it should be an expanded, not just first 3 months, 6 months. There ought to be a program for the whole first year where you're onboarding someone and getting them familiarized with your culture. But what do we believe in this organization? And is that clear to the individual all the way through that process, so that it matches what they heard before they were hired, and it's an authentic kind of purpose that they can connect to. Second, what are my strengths? Now you all are perfectly equipped to do this part. Of course, that's what you do. But how do I know my strengths, and then the second is, what is my role? So the third is, what is my role? So how do my strengths fit into a role that I'm being asked to do here? What is my role on the team? Who are my partners is a fourth one. Do I know clearly who my partners are, the people I can trust, the people who are going to have my back? That's really important. You can even think of it in terms of friends. Who are the people I can really count on in this organization? And then fifth, really important, related to why people stay and leave. What does my future here look like? Can I see where I'm headed? So if you focus on those 5, I think organizations could substantially improve that onboarding process. And I could see how a strengths coach could have a tremendous impact on all of those.
Yeah. The thing that I think really stands out in that, Jim, is the fact that I want to make sure we're really clear about this with the coaching community, is that question was asked to everybody, right? So 25-year vet was asked that question as much as a person who was asked that question in their 3rd day of employment. And Jim, I don't know if you looked at the data this way, but to me, it's interesting to at least consider perhaps the lower rating or certainly a perspective to be weighed in with our own coaching came from that person at 6 years, came from that person at 3 years, on the other side of that first 1 or 2 year experience, where we know there's a natural level of engagement that sustains at least what that feels like in that early onboarding experience. Do you have any reactions or thoughts or data around that, Jim?
Well, yeah, I think it's probably a combination of the brand of the onboarding program in terms of what people are saying, even those that have had it in the past, or what they're hearing from other people. And it's the other part of it is just personal experience when they happen to go through it.
Yeah.
So neither of those are good things, to be negative.
Right. Right. Well, here's the call out, right? And I think coaches, as you really bring this point home, is that those onboarding experiences are the biggest part, or one of the biggest messages that your employee value proposition is ever going to lead with externally, right? So when people come on board, there's a natural level of engagement. If you can feed into that specifically with your own coaching involvement, or help a company think about how they build out structures of coaching to support that, it doesn't have to become a point in time. That engagement can be sustained. And to Jim's point, it can be part of an ongoing story rather than this fragmented point in time experience where things were positive and really robust relative to our expectations. And the call out there is, why would we give that away? Why would we give that away? So you start off with an advantage. Build on that, right? Awesome.
Mike, I want to, before you move on, I want to add to this for the coaches particularly, and we don't spend a lot of time talking about this, but Jim said something that reminded me of it. We don't spend enough time doing strengths-based role mapping. So, think of, I hire software developers, so that's pretty easy to me. There's some specific roles, project managers, QA, software developers, architects, right? There's these roles that go into it. And we know if we've had them take CliftonStrengths. We know their top 5, and we know all 34 in that case. And we have an awesome opportunity to take this 12% number and bring it up by sitting down with that individual development plan that's included as part of the kit that they get when they train with us. In mapping, the middle section has a goal, and it's saying, okay, what is my role here? I'm joining this organization. This goal is my role. And then mapping that up through 3 or 5, whatever you want to do, and coming out with some really helpful outcomes that in their first week or 2 or 3 can really help them set them up for success, and knowing how they're going to point these individual talents, these talent themes at their role. I just don't think we do it enough. I get a chance to do this at college campuses in a capstone setting, and it works out really, really well. And I think we spend a lot of time doing that here. It's a manager's job to kind of get that done. A coach could do that, but think how smart a coach could be coming into an organization and doing this day 1, or let's just say maybe it's day 14. Maybe there's some things that need to happen, but early role mapping that's strengths based.
Yeah.
And I think there's to take that 12 and move it up. I think we're going to need to spend some time on the onboarding process of getting those roles mapped to their themes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Jim Carlson, you and I have a managing, a partner of ours, a manager who she uses the term job crafting, right? So it's still the job, but how do we uniquely hone it, right, around what your strengths are in a way that's unique and customized to you, even though it still fulfills that specific role that we were asking of you. So I love that language.
We may have hired you for one role, but as we start getting into it, we may see other things, this job crafting, these other things come out.
Right.
And we can't do that if we're not paying attention, and we can't see that if we're not collecting that information in the onboarding process.
Right. Jim Carlson, perfect segue as we head into our third data point, because right on cue, the 41%, coaches, check this out. Just 41% of employees strongly agree that their job description aligns well with the work they are asked to do. So just think about that scope creep or some of that erosion. I was given an offer. I said yes to it. It looked wildly exciting and it fits me well. And then somewhere along the way, that story changed, and probably doesn't feel as good now over the course of time. Jim Harter, what do we know about that particular data point, and what's our accountability there?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that could be going on underneath that one, Mike. One is, as you alluded to, a disconnect between what the job was that was promised and what they're actually asked to do. So to be real authentic about what the job is and what the job requirements are, and not that people are out there trying to pull a fast one on anybody, but I think that a lot of times realistic job previews are easier said than done. And I think organizations need to be very authentic about that. But I think the other thing, and it could be just as big, is the ability to, as roles change, to be agile as the organization changes, and as work expectations change, and as customer demands change. And the key to that agility part working right, from everything I've looked at, is those ongoing conversations we've talked about before, that the best managers are having ongoing, not overly intrusive, but ongoing conversations, so they're in touch with people, what work they're doing, how it aligns to customer demands. Then when changes happen, it's a much more fluid process. So to be in touch more frequently, and not just to be in touch in a semi-annual or annual review, but to help people know why the change is occurring. I think a lot of times that could be another part of it, is just not knowing why, right? Not having a clear picture about why. I'm thinking, well, this just changed. It doesn't map with what I was asked to do, and we all blame it on corporate, right? Instead of the manager helping them see that this is actually good for the organization, it's good for our customers, it's the right move for us. And then the third thing I'd think about with that one is how my role relates to other people's roles as those changes happen. So do I continuously know when I do X, somebody else will do Y, and that's a big part of just clarity of expectations that I think often gets overlooked. It's how your role relates to everybody else's role, and the more teams work together, the better that clarity is. So we've seen in our data that chance to do what you do best and the clarity of expectations increase at different increments, depending on how long you've been with the company, at 3 years and 10 years. Now, nobody wants to wait 3 years and 10 years, so we have to be much better than just letting things naturally fall out that way. And that's where those ongoing conversations come into play. And the shortcut of knowing someone's strengths, right? That's a shortcut because we know some information that it could take us years to figure out otherwise.
I love it. I love it. And I'm such a fan as a practitioner and consultant of the ongoing conversations, Jim, and the research bears it out. But I think it's a great space for coaches to pay a lot of attention to as we get into this data point, is thinking about coaching through managers, right? And I know we've had a lot of conversations about how coaches can coach through teams, through those interactions and equipping with managers. And when I boil it down, frequency increases focus, right? So when you think about true coaching, and we get into whatever metaphor or word picture you want to use, but when there's literally a daily practice, or a coach is on the sideline, metaphorically speaking, and is calling out the right plays for us and holding us accountable for where we ran the wrong one, that means something. It enhances and increases the focus. And I love where strengths plays a role in that. And I think what gets challenging on this item, where there's that erosion or that shift, is I think we start to lose our way in terms of what we're saying yes to and no to. And I think a lot of times, Jim, about even our database and strengths, there's so much achiever and so much responsibility, and so much of the accountability of our job is really wired us to say yes to almost everything, right? And then just figure it out later on whether we should have said no. And I think that increased frequency and what coaching represents, aligned with our strengths, allows us to say yes and no more accurately, in a way where that 41% doesn't have to be that number. Any response or reaction to that aspect of it?
Well, I think that's the reason that we see this pattern in people, and there's more and more matrix organizations now where we are changing teams, where we have multiple priorities that we're dealing with. And so while collaboration can increase in a matrixed environment, clarity of expectations and this item right here about what I'm asked to do and whether there's some alignment, that's at jeopardy. And so we have to, that's why the role of manager and team leader is so important, to help people think about, how do I prioritize when all these things are going on? To your point, I think people do want to say yes, and they want to achieve more. They want to do what's best for the company, and they need a coach or a manager to help them think about what comes first, where do you prioritize things? At what point do I take a step back and say, okay, does this have to be done now? Because a lot of times people will hear a request and they think it's got to be done now. If you dig a little deeper, you find out, well, I could probably do this after this and still get it done and meet the same kind of objectives and outcomes that customers are looking for.
Yeah.
So I think having those kind of that chance to slow down, think about it a little bit, and then come back to it, and that's where a coach or a manager can play a big role. And also the themes play into it too, right? Think about different people getting irritated by new requests, right? Somebody might be highly focused on something, and something new comes in, and it becomes a distraction where somebody else might just invite that automatically.
Right.
So
right, absolutely.
Jim, Lizzie in the chat room asked, are there any correlations between the 41% and Q12 outcomes, i.e. question 1 on expectations? Any correlations there?
Yeah, clarity of expectations is a big one. And a similar number, about half of people globally clearly know what's expected of them. So that's very way too low as well. And of course, there's a lot that goes into expectations, not just delegating and that sort of thing, but some of the things I talked about earlier around, do I know how my work relates to other people's work, and can I figure that out quickly, as opposed to having to wait 3 to 10 years to know that in my own head. So that's pretty important. I think do what I do best as well, I think fits right in there. And when people are, even though they might clearly know what they're supposed to do, if they're not doing what they do best, they're going to continue to have kind of negative impressions of their work, and it's going to affect, even though they might cognitively know what they're supposed to do, I think emotionally it's going to feel like they don't know what they're supposed to do.
Yeah.
Jim, Ralph had asked this question. When we think about these numbers, this is and we mentioned this early on, but these are state of the American workplace, so these are US numbers.
Yeah.
But when you look at global versus US on some of these metrics, and if you were to give a general overview, pretty close, or is the world way different than the United States? Sometimes we get the impression that the US is so different because we have open working standards, and we've got, we've kind of moved to more matrix teams and a lot of those kinds of things. But you look at these numbers every day, big differences, small differences, does it matter? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, on the individual questions, the differences are not, we've actually been doing a number of polls in Europe in recent years. Last year we did some in-depth polls where we can ask more additional questions like we have here in the U.S. in different countries in Europe, and we're seeing pretty similar figures. If you kind of add everything up and look at overall levels of engagement, though, the numbers in Europe have been declining, and they are lower than they are in the U.S. overall when you add everything up. But when you look at individual questions like these, they're in the ballpark. I guess I just say that nobody's optimized it yet, and we've got a lot of work to do. But the good news is some companies have, and of course, teams within companies have, and so there are best practices out there. It's not like nobody's not, that nobody's not doing it right. There are best practices out there to study, and that's good. There's a lot of variance within countries, I guess, is my point, across teams and companies.
Jim, do you know when we have the State of the Global Workplace set to refresh? I know we just did that, and that's in a book form, a little harder to get than our State of the American Workplace, which is available for download. But do you know? I kind of put you on the spot there. You can say
no. That's fine. Know. That's fine. Actually, I just had a conversation about this morning, so good timing, Jim. Have you been reading my email?
Doesn't happen here. It doesn't happen here.
We're planning on a 2020 next round. That's where we have enough accumulation of data in individual countries where we can, reliably give out figures, and then of course we'll have our update of our global number as well. Another kind of positive thing is that even though the numbers are too low on some of these things, they have been moving up in recent years, globally and in the U.S. So that's a positive trend. It's not moving as fast as we want it to, but at least it's going in the right direction.
Yeah, it's awesome. And Jim Harter, just take it as a compliment. If Jim Collison is reading your email, like nobody ever reads my email. So if the fact that you got the email is worth snooping on is a compliment. So no, that's good. All right, gentlemen, we're rounding the corner. We're touching all the bases here. Point number 4, and again, another stark, desolate number that came out of our State of the American Workplace report. But to me, coaches, when we think about this next data point, there's an alignment here when we think about our coaching putting our coachee into their own specific span of influence and control. It's consistent with what we want to do with strengths as we position that person for their best performance, and very consistent with engagement, right? Is that these are things that I can act on, and you've equipped me either through engagement or strengths to be able to do that. And there's a lot of confidence, right, and performance on the other side of that reality. But I want you in the backdrop of that to think about this next data point. Only 18% of employees strongly agree that employees who perform better grow faster at their organization. I'm going to repeat that again one more time. Only 18% of employees strongly agree that employees who perform better grow faster at their organization. So think about that backdrop of span of influence and control. Jim, what's not happening for 82% of the American workplace?
Well, a related question that we ask that gives about the same percentage is, my performance is managed in a way that motivates me to do outstanding work. So just how performance is measured is a fundamental to it, and many people, in fact most, don't feel that their performance is measured in a fair way. And so you got to kind of take a step back and say, well, what is fair performance measurement? Right. And of course, that requires something that's consistent with how you're developing over time, and that it's based on the right kinds of metrics. So you take a step back from that and say, well, okay, what are the right kinds of metrics? We found there are 3 categories that most metrics can fit into. Both subjective evaluation and objective kind of performance metrics fit into 3 general categories that all require ongoing discussion, but they include individual contribution, so some indications about how well that individual is performing. That can include productivity metrics, or whatever's relevant to the particular job the individual is doing. The second is team collaboration, so how well that individual is collaborating with others is important, and people can recognize that that's an important function of my job. Almost all jobs require some type of collaboration. And then third, what is my value to customers? So you could have positions that you're working with that are internal, that don't have direct customer facing, but they've still got some kind of an internal customer they're dealing with, or a constituency, really, that so that could be internal or external. But every job, if it doesn't have customer value in some way, you got to wonder about the job a little bit, right? Yeah. But those are kind of 3 criteria that you can link all sorts of things to, but it kind of simplifies it a little bit. But I think when people think about fair, one criteria is at the end of the year when they're getting their evaluation, is it a surprise or not? If it's a surprise in terms of how they did, they probably weren't having the right kinds of conversations throughout the year to know how they were doing, and which they should be having. And they shouldn't wonder why somebody got promoted and they didn't. So this is just one aspect of it, is that perform kind of part of the question. And then there's the growth component, and that's kind of embedded in having those right kinds of conversations as well. So that starting with onboarding, we said at the beginning, right? One of the 5th question for onboarding is what is my future here? That never leaves. People always want to know where they're headed. And so great managers and coaches help people stay focused on where they're headed. And that's going to change over time as the business changes and as opportunities change. But you've got to have those conversations to know. And then I guess probably the obvious thing to this group is there's a strengths component in there. For me to be performing higher and growing faster and feeling that that's legitimate, it's got to be aligned with who I am. So it's got to be aligned with my own development, my own natural abilities, and my skill development.
Yeah, I think that it's funny when you were saying that. I think there's a truth where this item really represents perception and reality. There's a lot of equity sensitivity in our workplaces. And one of the things I notice that when coaching is done well in our work environment, we can all be given the same opportunity, but different, right? So we're all the same, but different. And I think it's interesting when you put strengths up in front of an audience or an individual. It's very interesting in the shift from that culture representing a zero-sum situation, right? Where in order for Jim to win, then Mike has to lose. And I think if we just let nature take its course, I think that's representative of a lot of our culture and our human assumption or perspective about things. But when we use strengths, right? If we see and realize that, guess what? Jim Harter has 5 top strengths. Jim Collison has 5 top strengths. So does Mike McDonald. And guess what? We all have 34 strengths. Well, now I get mine, you get yours, we all get ours, and it shifts that from that zero-sum culture mentality to more of an abundance mentality. And I think it shifts how we collaborate and start to involve ourselves with each other. So I think coaching specific to that item, not just the outcome, right, that's measurable and expected and defined, but even the experience and the trust that we have that other people aren't getting the better end of the deal, so to speak, if our coaching does its job right. Jim, you have a reaction to that?
Yeah, I think you're right on. The thing I didn't mention earlier that you kind of touched on there was that the low-hanging fruit in terms of performance and engagement is involvement in goal setting. So oftentimes the default for managers is that they're kind of delegating the goals. But if there's involvement, right? If there's involvement, then you can work from the individual strengths to the right goals for that person. And this is also why the measuring performance through a forced ranking fails, because some teams could have all stars. Why do you force someone to fail if they're all stars? And some may not have any. So that's also a possibility. But the forced ranking within teams just isn't effective. But and it isn't based on a strengths-based philosophy, which says that everybody, if we're leveraging their strengths, should be able to improve their performance over time. Yeah,
absolutely. Jim Collison, any comments or questions from the chat room? Anything that you're thinking about right now as we?
Yeah, just a reminder, and Becca Holbrook in the chat room just did a great service for all of us. So 60%, Mike, the very first one, page 222 in the report.
That's nice, yeah.
Right? Number 2, 12%, page 363 in the report, if you go out there. 41%, page 784. And then number 4, or 18%, page 92. So if you're following along, it's in the chat room that will stay with this. I just said it. You can rewind and write those down if you want to do that as well. But a great service for that as well. Yeah, Mike, I think this, as we think about this number, 18%, believe there's a future. It really is kind of what they're saying here, that there's a future to the measurement of my performance. I think that in specific, there's a lot of hope inspired in that context, right? Or lack of hope, right? And so when you come and you start and you get through the onboarding, we talked about that a little bit earlier. And then you get past the honeymoon, and you start realizing they have no way of measuring me. And I don't know if that's going to be fair or right. And that just causes a lot of confusion. And
Yeah.
I think really starts, the engagement begins to drop off after that point.
Yeah.
And so I think that part's really important.
Yeah, I think the additive impact of each of these four, if they're done well, is obviously infinite in terms of what they could explain. But I think the threat on the other side, if they're not done well, I think we can mass produce victims at a frightening rate. And I think these numbers, Jim Harter, you tell me if this is true or not, but they kind of represent, here's what happens if you just let nature take its course. If you do nothing, these are the numbers that you will be dealt. But if you do something, to your point, what's the low-hanging fruit and opportunity available to us? Jim Harter, any reactions to that and concluding thoughts that you would leave us with as we put a wrap on our State of the American Workplace investigation?
Well, I think these all represent areas that organizations have to be intentional about, as you said. But I think to also think about how you address them in a way that's consistent with your organization's purpose. And how you want your brand represented. I think they can each be addressed at different stages of the employee's journey through the organization, maybe in somewhat different ways, depending on how they relate to expressing the purpose of the organization, how you want your brand represented, and what type of culture the organization is intending to build. If we mentioned agility earlier, a lot of organizations want agile cultures now. If an organization wants an agile culture, that's an even higher ante up in terms of those ongoing conversations and the intentionality of making sure managers have the right tools and coaches have the right tools so that these conversations can happen more regularly. And it's all much more efficient when you start from the basis of strengths. And so really appreciate all the work everybody's doing out there in this area.
Yeah,
I think those numbers will keep going up, hopefully.
Yeah. There's a definite critical mass to it. Well, Jim Harter, Dr. Jim Harter, Chief Workplace Scientist at Gallup, thank you so much for your time and your friendship to Jim Collison and I on the other side. It's great to just be able to interact with you on a daily, weekly basis and to have a chance to have this conversation with this audience today. So I loved it. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is awesome. It's awesome. And coaches, just think about those 4 points, right? This is a story you could tell in so many different ways, but still anchored around 60%, 12%, 41%, and 18%. That is not Jim Collison's locker number combination. That is actual data from our State of the American Workplace report that you can do things with. But our hope would be that just like you do with your coachees, that you bring their report to life for them. We really want to have guests and conversations, meaningful conversations that bring these resources to life for you and a success and assist in the success that you're having with your own clients. So wanted to put you all in a spot where you're coaching and your consulting converge to provide optimal, sustainable growth for all of your clients. So Jim Collison, we're back to you.
Thanks, Mike. Just a quick correction from Becca, that 60%, page 22, not 222, but 22 in that. And a reminder for coaches, these numbers start the conversation where you're working, right? So if you're talking to managers, if you're talking to executives, these numbers are just a starting place. One of the reasons I wanted to do this series, and I pushed hard to get Mike McDonald and Jim Harter on. Trust me, you don't get Jim Harter to show up twice for 2 webcasts unless it's super important. But was for you to be able to start the conversation, but to know where the data came from. I think sometimes we get into organizations and you say these numbers and you're going to have some folks that are high analytical who are going to say, yeah, but where did that come from? And we wanted to be able to point you back to a resource to say exactly right here. Jim Harter, in the back of a lot of these reports is a bunch of meta, right, that exists of where this all came from. Is that in the State of the American Workplace? Is that appropriate as well? Could they go to the back of the book to find out where this data came from and its sample size and those things?
Yeah, it's all referenced in the back in an appendix. But if you want the actual reports, they're all on our website as well. So the meta-analysis reports are out there and a lot of other in-depth reports.
You bet. In a pretty easy search, just go to Gallup.com, search State of the American Workplace. It'll pull it up. You can give us a little bit of information, download it, and a big, gigantic. I would not send that to the printer right away unless you want to kill a few trees. It's pretty large, but great online, very searchable that way. We'll remind everyone to take full advantages of all the resources we have available at the Gallup Strengths Center. Send us your questions or comments. You can put those in an email. If you got questions around this, we may even be able to get that over to Jim if either Mike and I can't answer it for you. So coaching@gallup.com. You can catch the audio, both in video of this program, as well as all the past ones. If you're going to watch it on YouTube or download it to your phone, if you want to listen to it on the road, in a train and a plane, You can get information on how to do that, coaching.gallup.com. If you're interested in becoming a Gallup certified strengths coach, we got a list of all the courses that lead to that. There's really just a few, but all our courses are available out there, courses.gallup.com. And I'll mention that if you want to stay up to date on Mike, you and I have a whole series based on research. Women in the workplace, millennials, right? Coming up.
Yes, absolutely. Performance development. Stay tuned. This Friday, everyone. Some of you have had the pleasure of having heard from her before, but we're going to have Heather Wright. And she's going to be sharing with us her insight and personal perspective, an application about women in the workplace and what does that report uniquely represent in our coaching and all the outcomes that the workplace and women need to optimize those roles and opportunities.
If you want to stay up to date on that, head out to gallup.eventbrite.com. Click the follow button. And every time, like I do not have all those series out there right now. I've been loading them kind of a little bit at a time so that I don't over inundate the folks that have signed up that way. But gallup.eventbrite.com, click follow. You'll get an email notification every time we post a new one out there. Just a reminder, we referenced this a few times, but It's the Manager that will launch on May 7th. You can pre-order that right now. If you go to itsthemanager.com, we also have a ton of resources available for you for pre-order. So, in fact, you'll get to hear more of Dr. Jim Harter. He's done some videos for you as well. We've been releasing those as we prepare for this book launch. I think what may be the definitive work that we are just getting started on when we think about the manager and the impact the manager has. I think Jim will actually solve some of our engagement problems when we really start focusing on the manager and figuring out that the manager has a lot to do with that 34% here in the US. And what's the global number for engagement, Jim?
15%.
15% globally when we realize that. So that book will launch May 7th. Itsthemanager.com. I want to thank you for joining us today. We got a lot ahead here for the rest of the year. Don't forget the CliftonStrengths Summit is coming up as well, June 3rd, 4th, and 5th here in Omaha. And you can go to CliftonStrengthsSummit.com to get some information. It's filling up fast. So you might want to, if you're listening to this before that, you might want to get out there and get that done now. We'll be back with more webcasts this week. Thanks for joining us, everybody. With that, we'll say goodbye.